It's a real pleasure to be here and talk about the importance of intellectual property. I had the pleasure of working with Lally Remantilla, who I saw right there at BDC for a number of years, and we spent a lot of time thinking about the importance of intellectual property, and that's especially true, and you heard it on the previous panel, whenever you're doing something that's very tech intensive. And the more tech intensive it is, we call that, you can call it hard tech or deep tech or whatever the hell you want, but basically the more tech intensive it is, the longer it usually takes to get that to market, and the more time and the more money it takes to get that to market. And what that means is we have startup companies that are pre-revenue for a long time, and some of those startup companies are raising hundreds of millions of dollars. If you're a chip company, Sonia knows this as well, even though she's sneaking out, that you can raise several $100 million, and then the question as an investor is, what have you got? And you heard it from Glenn before, the IP that you have is a critical piece of that overall value that you have as a startup company. And that IP can be formal and can be informal. The TSMC example was a lot of informal IP related to their processing that they keep close. That's a huge advantage. We have quantum companies that have raised, Xanadu, look at Xanadu. They've raised more than 250 million. They do have a strong IP portfolio, but that IP is both formal and informal. Okay, so in this panel right now, we're talking about getting IP. I see other friends in the audience as well. We're getting IP, particularly out from a research institution into a spin-out or a startup. We're going to focus on startups and spin-outs. We're not going to focus on multinationals. So we're going to talk about how do we get IP from one of these fantastic Canadian research institutions into a spin-out or a startup. We're going to differentiate in our remarks a little bit biotech versus all the other non-biotech. Biotech is a little bit different in terms of how its IP behaves. So when we talk about it, we'll differentiate that a bit, but most of the conversation will be about science and engineering IP. And we are going to focus a little bit on venture capital, even though we acknowledge, and this is a propeller head talking to you, that venture capital is exactly the right solution for some companies some of the time. Okay, it's not a panacea. It's not the right solution for every company all the time. It's the right solution for some companies some of the time, but those are typically the companies that are going through their very, very high growth, and that's obviously of interest to the economy. That's why we focus on them. And we're going to address this under three overarching themes: speed, simplicity, and aligned interests. So we're going to talk about how do we get to speed, how do we get to simplicity, and how do we get to aligned interests. Those are the themes for getting this IP. So we'll start with speed, then we'll do simplicity and aligned interests. I'm going to set the context. You can see the bios of these people. We've got Omar, who is the sort of 10-year in the trenches, most experienced IP operator that I know in Canada, most creative. We have David, who's been 20 years working on IP, mostly from the legal side. And we have Louis, who has been both operator 15 years and legal side 25 years, or maybe it's 20 and 20, but it adds up to 40, which means you're old like me. That's right. That's right. So I'm going to start with speed. So here's the context. Startups don't have 2 years to negotiate an IP transfer. I'm an investor. They need to lock in the access to that IP in a matter of months, not years. Otherwise, I, as an investor and everyone else, will walk away. They need access locked into the IP in order to facilitate their fundraising, and then their hiring and building the business. Until they get some type of secured access to that IP on a rapid turnaround, then they're not really viable as a startup company. So I want to address concrete actions that any of you have seen that would either hinder, like a story that says, here's where we were hindered on speed, or an example which you say, wow, we did this and it really went fast. Something like that. We'll start there.
Yeah, I can start. Hello, so I'm Louis Carbonneau. So I'm the founder and CEO of Tangible IP. We're a capital brokerage firm and IP advisory firm. Is that on?
Is it on? It's not on?
1, 2, 1, 2. Switch. Okay, it came with the switch off. Yeah, so Louis Carbonneau. Tangible IP, we're probably the largest patent brokerage firm in the world. We also do a lot of advisory work. Prior to that, which is more relevant to this panel, I was at Microsoft for 15 years. I'm from Seattle, like the coffee you've been drinking today. And I was the head of the IP licensing business and also worked and supported all of our research organization there, which was basically over 1,000 PhDs, most of them coming from academia, only in the software world. So it was quite interesting in terms of herding cats. So before we get into answering your question, I'd like to preface a few things because I've been living in the States for almost 30 years. Obviously, IP is seen very differently there. I think it's important to kind of look at the macro picture because it explains a lot of things that we're going to talk about and what we can do right or wrong. The first thing I always tell people is innovation without protection is just a form of philanthropy. And we've been very good at doing charity in Canada for the last few decades. We're subsidizing the rest of the world's R&D essentially by publishing everything we do and not protecting it very well. And we've had this mentality in research centers and universities where it's publish or perish. And in reality, it's been a lot more publish and perish because, what they've done essentially is publishing everything, and we have, as we've seen in other panels earlier, very little to show for that. Fortunately, a lot of that can be changed by aligning incentives first in terms of research. It all starts with the research and what we do with it. Very often when it comes down to technology transfer offices, commercialization offices, it's too late. There's been IP leakage, as we've just heard on the previous panel, very often done by the very people who invented, the technology because, they published or they talked to people without NDA, they didn't file a provisional, et cetera, et cetera. I'll give you an example. When I was at Microsoft, we had about 1,000 PhD. They all came from academia. They all arrived with the same kind of wide-eyed, I have to publish everything, that's how my reputation has been made, peer review, et cetera, et cetera. And it took us quite a bit of work, but we succeeded in aligning incentives more with a commercialization output and outcome because that's what a large company wants to do. And the first thing we did is basically realign performance incentives so that publication was not the only thing by which they were measured. They were also measured, in terms of their patenting activities. Sometimes it was reviewing other people's patents, or by the technology transfer they were able to do internally. And if you think, I've seen how hard it is to do technology transfer internally with between colleagues. So I know how hard it is to do with outside people. It's 10 times harder. So first thing I would say in terms of what works is just having better incentives so that researchers first are better educated about the do's and don'ts, but I think we're doing much better job in Canada with this. But more importantly, they need to be incentivized in a way that they will want to create technology that can be commercialized. I think that's the first thing in terms of the mindset. Second, they need to realize that IP is not played the same way everywhere. In the US and in most of the world now, IP is a full contact sport. Yet we still play this game like it's a recreational or a beer league here. And that also needs to change because unless and until you realize that and mentalities change, we're going to have the same issue, the same behaviors, the same reflexes over and over and over, and we're going to have the same conference 10 years from now and asking the same questions. So now, long introduction. So I'll stop there because I think in terms of the nitty-gritty, there are a lot of things that these two guys are more entrenched with that they can talk to. But I just want to give the macro picture because I think it informs what we need to do to make things a little bit easier when it comes to commercialization of technology companies.
Omar, Dave, do you want to talk about, we can roll things together if you want to tell one or two stories that address these themes of speed, simplicity, and aligned interests. I don't know how you want to do it.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to try and avoid things that we've all heard often. But so I'm the CTO of TandemLaunch. We're a venture capital fund that takes a startup studio model. We've been around since 2010, so one of the older ones. We built about 35 companies since then, all of which were based on university research. The advantage that we had, though, was that we couldn't limit ourselves to a single nation. We couldn't just focus on Canadian universities. We'd never have enough investments to fill our pipeline. And so we had the entire world to choose from, at least from countries that did have international tech transfer policies. The result of that was that we could assert our our plans top down. Because if a university wasn't going to, for example, have an equity-focused deal with us or wasn't going to move quickly, we had a pipeline. We could move on to somebody else. But what that demonstrated was that having a predictable plan for how you're going to commercialize the technology, a license agreement that everyone understands, does indeed result in the kind of speed that you might be looking for. Though the point on alignment really shouldn't be ignored. These offices usually have single decision makers. There is no real thick bureaucracy here that's preventing these agreements from being signed. And a lot of people talk about professor incentives as if the issue was incentivizing them to do something, like it's a zero-sum game between publishing and patenting. But there's a world where both of those things can exist and do for very successful professors. The issue is actually the misalignments. So when it comes to signing these license agreements, the TTOs are the decision makers on what they end up protecting. It's not like publishing a paper where it's not in the hands of a TTO, it's not in the hands of the university at all. If they get rejected or accepted, it's up to some body external, so the university doesn't take any responsibility for the professor's experience there. But a tech transfer office is choosing what to patent and what not to patent based on a limited budget. They're choosing how to negotiate each deal and what terms are there. And their customers primarily are still the professors, and those professors talk to each other. They compare deals. They wonder why their spin-out didn't work out and the other ones did. And so until you figure out how to create a deal structure that's transparent, not just to the TTO, but also to the professor, so that they start to see why those asymmetries exist and almost take the decision power away from the TTO. Let them be able to say, oh, well, the market decided this, not us. That's going to do a lot for your speed as well and for your throughput.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is David Durand. So I have a couple of different hats. One of them is being MVIP, which is my consultancy firm. I also have a legal practice where we do some opinion type work and be able to work on type of deals or on the licensing side. As well as I work with Kyle Briggs as well as TJ Misra on the question of the simple agreement for innovation licensing, the CEL agreement. That is something that we're building a national committee of engagement on. So this is where part of the conversation is quite interesting, is because Omar mentioned it was the question of transparency, the type of guides that need to be put out, the type of agreement that's in plain English language or plain language writing that people can understand, the layperson, the tech transfer offices, the scientists, et cetera, so they're all able to understand what they're getting or what they're engaging into. This basically addresses the question of, or the issue of avoiding a conflict of culture between the entrepreneurs, the professors, as well as the investors. So what had happened with the CEL agreement was it had started off with a roundtable in Ottawa last February, where we did have different stakeholders at the table. We had government agencies, we had funders, we had investors, we had the researchers all come around the table and put their input as to what the type of agreement should look like. From that, we got some additional assistance from an expert from the Treasury Board of Canada or had worked for the Treasury Board of Canada. And then she had brought her UK experience in terms of being able to say, how does this get translated from a document that first started off with a lot of legalese into something that was a lot simpler, comprehensible. So this question of being able to call it level the playing field for all is extremely important. That is what I feel would accelerate the process, because we know that what impedes or hinders the process, obviously, if you want to hear that personal story, for instance, I was representing about $2 billion of money at a table that wanted to acquire IP from a university, and the moment that a cease and desist letter had been received by the university from a foreign university down south, that is what created a huge friction point, to the point that the Saturday morning phone calls I was having with the investors, they all scuttled because they are not there. The principal business is not to fund litigation. But at the same time, it also brought up the problem of risk. Did the universities want to engage in that type of risk, and how far would they go to be able to defend the IP that was being created from the university? And that was, for me, a very eye-opening experience, because, as a lawyer, the first thing you want to do is be able to respond and say, I have something solid, valid. Not take me to court on it, because we know that universities don't necessarily want to litigate, but at least to be able to push back and not take the avenue of, I don't think I should respond to this today.
Omar, Louis, from your own experience, a story where things actually went really well, and what were the ingredients of speed or simplicity or alignment that made it work?
So I think the idea of the sale agreement was fantastic. But what I think it doesn't recognize, and it's the same thing that some investors don't recognize when they call themselves deep tech investors, is that there is always a period of ambiguity at the beginning when you're exploring what the value of this thing is going to be, if it has any value to you whatsoever. There's a discovery phase even in the market. That's why it takes a couple more years to reach product market fit. You've got to find technology market fit before you can even start. And so as a result, we criticize investors for not being patient enough, but at the same time, founders need to be able to dive into that ambiguity a little bit with their agreements with the university as well. We discovered very early on that we weren't comfortable, universities weren't comfortable signing license agreements off the bat, especially if they were exclusive. First, how are you going to judge the value of the person you're licensing it to other than they came first? And after that, how are you going to decide, let's say, what fields you want to end up commercializing in? We want to go in all fields at the beginning because we have no idea where we're going to end up, but the university doesn't want to give up hypothetical opportunity cost. And so we developed a structure using option agreements. We found a way to essentially tie in the due diligence milestones that a university wanted to have. Are you a credible business? You're going to raise at least one round of financing. You're not in trouble with the law. And we tied them in as diligence milestones to allow us to exercise options to these exclusive technologies after a certain period of time. And it gave us the best of both worlds. It allowed us to explore the market fully. It allowed us to explore the value of the technology and what role it was going to play before we signed away, for example, equity permanently. It allowed the university then to also have an intrinsic structural due diligence in the process of us building the company without them including a bunch of very burdensome terms in the license as well, which we've all seen when they're trying to protect a million imaginary downsides. And so I would say where it went well for us, where this particular structure went really well for us was when we actually ended up not needing the technology that we'd optioned, because we would have given up 1/10 of the company had we signed that license right off the bat.
Yeah, a couple of examples where things went really well. The first one is on the process standpoint. So I've been, I don't know if Jesse is still in the room, but I've been advising Axelis for the last 3-4 years on their, IP strategy and processes. And what we've discovered very quickly is researchers didn't really know where to start from. And then by the time things arrived, at the technology transfer offices, it was too late very often. Mistakes had been made, things were gone. So we set up to prepare a lot of tools and decision trees and push this upstream to the researchers. And the feedback I've heard that these were really used a lot. So it's just a matter of educating, but giving them tools they can use where they don't have to call someone every time, because otherwise they won't, and they'll just do whatever they want to do. So having tools at the researcher's level to really understand what they need to do, and more importantly, what they shouldn't be doing, so that things don't get compromised, I think is really important. At the individual level, my experience, and I've done deals with U.S. and with Canadian universities. When things don't go well, it's usually because the TTO is trying to make up their numbers on your deal, and they become extremely greedy, thinking that, oh, this one is worth really a lot of money, so we're going to ask for a very high royalty rate. And when I've had good experiences, with McGill or Waterloo, for instance, is when the TTO officers are sophisticated enough to understand that this is kind of we'll make it on the volume, and if you're too greedy on any individual deal, you're going to basically just screw things up, and the deal won't go through, and you will lose a great opportunity. So I think it requires a lot of flexibility and humility to understand that one deal is not going to make your year. You have to really make things easy for the startup to be successful. You have to make sure there's a way for them to have a fully paid up license at some point, so that if they get acquired, someone doesn't have to drag the university forever. Things like this, I think, help a lot with the long term.
On the alignment question, maybe let's talk about that a little bit. The idea that, and I'm going to poke on an uncomfortable topic, which is the balance between equity and royalties. When you're talking about licensing intellectual property from a research institution to a startup, as an investor, I walk away from a lot of deals at first blush if I see a royalty level that is too high, or I see an equity level that is too high. And I'm increasingly concentrating on deals that have equity levels around 5% and royalty levels around 0%. And from an investor point of view, that's friendly, but guess what? There are enough of those deals out there to feed us, and we're walking away from the other ones. So I just want to poke a little bit on this balance between the tension between those two and the alignment of the investor community, the startup founders, and the research institution. There's another piece to that, which is that the startups have zero money and lots of equity, and sometimes we're asking for them to cough up money in these deals. And as an investor, a little bit of money's fine if I know what I'm getting paid for, but a lot of money doesn't wash. So maybe comment on the alignment. How do we, where in your experience have you seen the best alignment or maybe the worst alignment?
Well, from our perspective, it's from a sell perspective, what we're looking at is following, are you respecting the 6 axioms when you're engaging in a sell process? And one of them would be the axiom of benefit, to make sure that everyone agrees on the building of value within the spin-out. Then there's the axiom of ownership, knowing when does the technology transfer from university towards the spin-out, based on predetermined milestones, and that's looking at the questions of the royalties and also the question of equity. And with respect to the question of equity and value creation, that's where lies the major part of the discussion, but it's one that you have to trust in the process between the investors, the TTO, and the spin-out. So you're looking at basically a trilateral agreement where you're looking at the rights of each and being able to find that type of compromise and transparency at first. And going to the question of valuation, the thought process that we had behind that is to put the valuation, defer it to a valued round or where you had more investors getting involved in determining what is the actual value of the company. And that's something that would have to be considered. And in the universities, I think, and this is where I'm not quite as strong and where Kyle Briggs is a lot stronger than I am on that, is you have to follow the data points on that. And I think that question of being able to get access to all the data that speaks to the power laws and the risk, you'll see that the 5% equity would probably be the right fit for universities. And if you do more of those transactions over a longer period of time, it's a lot more beneficial for the university and for the public sector universities because they'll be able to amass a lot more capital. Now, the next question that one could ask themselves, and this is not the conversation for today, but is how do universities accept that equity as well? Because each of them have a different governance model and also how the endowment funds work as well. But I leave that to the experts.
Yeah, so I'm also a venture partner with a large VC firm, and we've done a ton of investment in startups that have deals with universities. And what we find out, I mean, whether it's equity or royalty, obviously the lower the number, the better from an investor standpoint, but we can work with that. What I think we like as investors, especially thinking about an eventual exit, is a way to have some finality and the role of the university or the investment of the university. And by this, I mean, whether it's a equity or royalty, what we'd like to know is that, if there's an acquisition, if there's an exit, there's a way to terminate this, to end this by having a fully paid up, pre-negotiated, fully paid up price, or some multiple, something pre-agreed, or a formula at least, where we know that the buyer who's going to spend millions of dollars can use some of that to, disinterest, the university, and the university does well, everybody does well. But I think it's more important than the rate of royalty. If I see a royalty rate or equity that is a bit high, but I have a fully paid up, license at the end that I can, trigger at exit, and it's reasonable, then I don't care about the rate because 5% of no revenues is still zero. So it's really more about what happens when there's an exit, and you don't want to drag that equity in the cap table for the foreseeable future. So for me, it's more important to have a way out than have numbers that don't mean that much when the company is very small.
Yeah, perhaps if that question always makes me a little bit sad because I feel like it's the result of a small market. But the fact is that at the end of the day, that number doesn't really matter, right? We have to go in and size the value of a business if everything goes well. And then we have to work backwards based on how we maximize the optionality for that to happen. And then we have to look at the license agreement and see if it provides the company that level of optionality. We work in consumer tech, which means we can't even have royalties. It doesn't matter what the number is. If it's 0.001, we still won't be able to build that company because good luck getting Apple to give you their device numbers, for example. So it's the structure for us that's always mattered a lot more. The economics do matter. but the structure is what you need to look at first. And then the economics matter insofar as, well, how valuable do you think this business can really be? And if investors truly believe the valuation they're putting on the company, then they should have a clear idea of what they're willing to take and not take in the license agreement, because they should be able to value what the university's contribution is. And the challenge I find that happens, from one side of our mouths, we're asking universities to accept equity over royalties, and from the other, we call them dead weight or passive cap table players. And I think part of the challenge is that we have to see them as different equity participants. They are passive now, but they represent years and years and years of supported ingenuity with taxpayer dollars that I think we really need to keep in mind.
If we pull on that thread just for a minute, have you seen examples where continued engagement with the university is beneficial? For example, a research team that has generated some patents is quite likely to generate 1 or 2 more patents going forward. And a spin out from that research team is sometimes quite likely to need some laboratory access to some of those tools. How do we think about that?
Yeah, I love this question, if I may. So the only reason why, to go to the original point, the only reason why university equity is passive is because entrepreneurs keep it passive. You can make that equity work for you. It develop based on the relationship you have with your inventors. You can get all the improvements you want on those patents. You can get privileged access to those labs. And I think founders need to also bake that into their mindset, that these are relationships that can pay you massive outsized dividends if you nurture them, and take your mind out of the startup treadmill for a bit.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's an utilized resource. Very often what we will do in a deal is, very often you have the PhD student following with the spin out. And then you have the thesis advisor, the tenured professor, still being there at the university. We very often will, take that person and, put that person as a technical advisor, paid advisor for a certain number of hours and all this, and then continue the relationship, and then basically give contract, research contracts and contract money to the university to continue the relationship, and have this as kind of an evergreen, R&D, where you can obviously pay a fraction of the price it would take to build that resource internally by just leveraging the university resources with the same team essentially that created the core technology. So I think having this synergistic relationship is very important and very underutilized still today.
I agree. As a as a deep tech investor, I'm looking for that relationship. I'm looking for not a one and done. I'm looking for the startup to have access to future IP, and I'm often looking for the startup to incubate some piece of their continued tech development in the university for a little bit of time. And I'm also willing to negotiate on equity with the university for those advantages. Anything finally on simplicity of the agreement? Sometimes, and David, you mentioned it, that starting things out in a simple manner is the best. Some comment on, you don't want to pay an expensive lawyer, but in fact, if you do, you end up in a much, much better place. And then the more expensive the lawyer you pay, typically they'll do something that's more and more simple for you, and you'll think, why am I paying so much for something that's so stupid? And the answer is, if you pay less, you'll get something more complicated, and then you may get rejected in the future. Do you have any experience there, David?
I've had a lot of experiences. I think what it comes down to is a question of trust with your counsel is very important. You also have to, going back to the former question as well as the question of dialogue with the university, very important. I'm of the opinion that, good fences make good neighbors, and also you don't want to burn the bridge either with your communications with universities as well, because there's always going to be something that's going to be post-transaction. There's always going to be a question of who has the right to the improvements. Most likely the universities will hold on to that, knowing that they have to also have access to be able to do more publications in the future as well. So that's a bit of, that's the Canadian ecosystem today. It might be different in other jurisdictions, but it's something that's key to be understood.
We started 5 minutes late. We're going to end up 10 minutes late. If we do 2 questions or 3 questions right now, if anyone has a question, we'd be pleased to take it, and then we'll wrap up. There's one question over there, and was there one here? Sorry, you have a question? Okay. sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question, maybe double click on, you mentioned, universities aren't active investors after sort of they spin the company out and you guys jumped in. I'd love to hear a little bit more on ideas, opportunities, low-hanging fruit to turn them into active investors along the journey with you.
Great question. I'm gonna re-ask that question in another way, which is why does the University of Calgary, that is 1/3 the size of the University of Toronto, have more spin-outs? Does anybody know the answer? Anybody from Calgary here? Who knows the answer? Because they're active investors. They have their own seed fund, 25 million, and they have their own investment committee, and they're investing seed checks into those startups, and they have a simple agreement that moves very, very fast for getting that IP out to those startups. So I would kudos to Calgary. They are a leader in this space across the country. And it's because they're active investors. Sorry, there was a quick follow-up? Okay, sorry. Yep. Okay, we'll follow up on that. And that was covered a little bit by keeping the startup engaged with the university and from the point of view of the founders, the startup, and the investors, it's access to new follow-on IP, and it's access to university resources, which could be labs. Also, to a lesser degree, talent. What I mean to say is the talent is critical, but you can get it through multiple channels.
Yeah, and the nice thing is most of the times, all the foreground IP that has yet to be developed this way will be captured in the one agreement that's already in place. You don't have to go back and amend all the time. You set the infrastructure and the parameters, and then you just basically continue the relationship.
Assuming you have a good, simple agreement, I agree.
And a good, simple agreement will recognize that a university is a public organization. And so I think universities have a ton of money, right? As long as you put it towards a public good, in a public good direction. There's many places where your startup, despite the fact that it's trying to hold a commercial advantage, a competitive advantage, trying to maintain a margin against competition, can tolerate publication. It can tolerate these things with slight delays, et cetera. And so I think that first, universities and entrepreneurs could get together and start thinking about where those opportunities align, and then think about how we can devise these agreements such that we produce safe rails so that universities know, if I'm signing this agreement, I'm not going to get into some reputational trouble later. And then I think universities get into their head a lot about conflicts of interest between their professors and things like that, and it just feels to me like that's probably overblown, and that there might be ways to address that don't result in slow negotiations or just bad relationships with their startups.
Yeah, I agree on conflict of interest. Calgary, as an example, had a very hard time constructing an investment committee because they said, oh, wait a minute, we're going to bring these investors in who have preferential access to the university IP. That doesn't work. We're going to get lambasted. And they were worried about conflict of interest. They finally solved it by saying, because the idea is if you want to create an investment committee, you want to create the investment committee with entrepreneurs and with people that were actually interested in investing their own money. Because you have an investor committee that is not interested in investing money, then that's the wrong group of people on your investment committee. And they couldn't get around the university couldn't get its head around the idea that they would have an investment committee of community entrepreneurs and angels that would see and invest money on behalf of the university and then also invest money on their own behalf. And they said, oh, that's a conflict of interest. You're investing the university money and you're investing your money, you're going to profit yourself. The way they solved that problem was by saying, not we're going to push those expert investors out the door. That's one way, and that has been solved in other universities that way. But they said we're going to creep those expert investors as our internal investment committee. And if any of these startups subsequently take external money, then those investors can do whatever the hell they want to do, given that that external investment has already happened. That's a bit of a technical detail, but it's a huge conflict of interest problem that we don't solve. Very last question, madam.
I was just going to add to...
You don't, no.
No more?
No,
All right,
no.
fair
We're
enough.
out of time.
I just wanted to know, given the small market problems and some of the realities of comparison between Canadian markets, other ones, excuse me, do you think it's actually a productive conversation to do an educative piece to try and change the risk profiles, to try and change investor perspectives, to try and change these relationships? If we're looking at speed and the reality of the Canadian tax dollar actually benefiting this generation that is paying it, which is a nice goal, frankly. At what point is it like, let's try and change everybody's relationships and perspectives, and what point is it, can we thrive with this ecosystem?
Great question. Small market, how do we change people?
I can speak to- I
and
just have
and
one
is there
comment on that.
motivation to do so? I think I've heard the entire day has been about Canada's scientific potential. We generate 4.5% of the world's science, 1% of the world's IP. What the hell's wrong with us?
Yeah, related to the conflict of interest point, it's okay if some people have an advantage over others and make some more money because they took the risk first. And I think we need to start thinking about monetary incentivization for people that are willing to take that risk. There's, I think, a reason why most investors follow essentially what the US patterns in terms of their investment, SaaS, B2B. We all saw the same patterns, and it's because it's the same reason why Marvel movies suck. The downside is too large, and there's just too small of a market for it. So I think it's okay if we embrace monetary incentive for taking risk at that stage, and I think that's the fastest way to the solution.
Yeah,
Last comment, Louis?
Yeah, well, on the education, I think it's absolutely necessary. IP has been an afterthought in Canada and still is, for too many places. You look at today's theme, which is creating IP-savvy business leaders. This is exactly what education should do. I work with U.S. entrepreneurs and Canadian entrepreneurs all the time, and I can tell a difference, in terms of their upbringing, in terms of their exposure to IP and how they get it. It's nobody's fault except the system that doesn't teach these things. The same way we talk about the last hockey game, but not enough about the way corporations work, and it's just cultural. So, and the policy, I think, reflects a gap in the culture. So we need to work on education. At the same time, we're doing 100 other things, It's a multi-pronged attack here, but we definitely need to invest in education.
David, did you have a last comment too?
Hi. The comment that I have to make is that, for example, if you look at the UC fund from Calgary, and I think there's also the one based out of the UK as well, but the impact that you have from that is for every $1 invested in the UK, for instance, you can get 7 out. And that's a massive, massive number. And the last comment also that I'd like to make is going back to the folks of defense, but you have to keep in mind that Canada is still one of the 10 largest economies in the world. And that speaks a lot to what we're able to do and how much further we can go by getting our policy right.
Thanks very much. I want to pull this together and say that I will leave a set of pages up here. This is the latest BDC attempt to generate a one-page, very high-level term sheet for IP spin-out from a university. We've been working on it for about 2 years, and it pulls together the detailed work that David and Kyle have done and the operational work that Omar has done in this two-step agreement. So if you want to know how to do it, not on a legal basis, but on a very high level, in a way that would instantly resonate with an investor, please take a copy of this, and we'll see how it goes. Otherwise, I'm going to thank the panel, no? Yeah, thanks. Let's thank the panel.